All right, now we're going to look at osmoreceptors, right, that are regulated here. So here in this region that I just pointed out, this is called the hypothalamus, as you learned before. So this is below the thalamus region, and its main function in terms of osmoregularity is it controls the release of this hormone called ADH. ADH's main function was what? Do you remember? Water retention. Good. So hypothalamus is the region where the posterior pituitary hormones are created. However, in the posterior pituitary hormones, we have the actual hormones being stored, right? And so all these hormones are being created by these neurosecretory cells when stimulated. One way of stimulation for ADH release is osmolarity, changes in osmolarity. So what was osmolarity? When we look at the actual ratios of solute to solvent. So what was a solute? What was a solvent? So solute is what's being dissolved in the solvent, right? So examples of solutes in the body: sugar, salts, fats, proteins. Solvent is usually blood or even water, right? So when you have an increased solute to solvent ratio, when there is an increase, this leads to increased osmolarity. Whenever you have a decreased solute to solvent ratio, you have a decreased osmolarity, right? And so whenever you have high osmolarity, you have a high secretion of antidiuretic hormone because you want to maintain the osmotic balance, right? If this ADH hormone was not present and you have a high osmolarity, a lot of the fluid in the tissues would actually migrate into the bloodstream, which could eventually cause necrosis of the tissues, and the cells, the actual tissue would die, right? The perfect example of this is diabetes. So diabetes is a perfect pathological condition involving a problem with osmolarity, right? So if there is an increase in osmolarity, right? So I put an increase in this ratio. This increase causes the receptors, the osmotic receptors in the hypothalamus to begin to have a increased activity, right? So these regions, remember the supraoptic nucleus, this is where the actual cells are being created. So the neurosecretory cells that are creating the hormones create antidiuretic hormones specifically, right? So if you remember that acronym I put for you before in the previous videos, you'll remember. So the supraoptic nucleus produces antidiuretic hormone, right? And so this increased osmolarity generates action potential on this nucleus, the supraoptic nucleus, in order to produce the antidiuretic hormone. And eventually, whenever the right action potential is generated from the hypothalamus, opens up and lets these hormones leave from the inferior hypophyseal vein, right? So ADH now then goes to the regions, for example, let's look at some examples here, like the kidneys. So it goes to the kidneys. So in the kidneys, what happens is the collecting duct in the kidneys become highly porous and allowing for a lot of fluid, specifically water, to leave the renal system and enter the circulatory system. You look at, for example, what else? You can look at the integumentary system, so the skin, right? So the skin, during perspiration is actually inhibited because, when you perspire in the skin, you have these glands called the sudoriferous glands or the sweat glands. Those are inhibited because you want to retain water as much as possible. And also, you have a increase in blood pressure via the vascular system, right? So your blood vessels begin to constrict in order to increase blood pressure, in order to transmit all of the actual fluid that's necessary to all the other parts of the body, right? And so these phenomena are regulated from an increased osmolarity. However, vice versa, if I put the opposite, if there is a decrease in osmolarity or decrease in solute to solvent ratio, this decrease inhibits the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, and all of these downstream cascade that I talked about from in the beginning does not happen, right? So the supraoptic nucleus does not begin to secrete ADH from its neurosecretory cells. And so because of no ADH, nothing goes into the blood and into the circulatory system here or leave the inferior hypophyseal vein. And so nothing gets affected from the kidneys, the integumentary system, or the vascular system, right? So these ratios are really important to maintain osmotic balance in order to prevent any kind of pathological abnormalities. For example, like I said in the beginning of the video, diabetes. Diabetes is a perfect example. You have too much sugar, you have an increased solute to solvent ratio, and this leads to a activity of this phenomena.